If dark, real crime stories keep you awake at night, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because tonight, we're stepping inside one of the most feared jails in America. The night the body was found, the rain over New York City fell like needles. Cold. Relentless. Across the dark waters of the East River, floodlights burned over the massive complex known as Rikers Island. From a distance, it looked like a fortress. Concrete towers. Razor wire. Endless rows of barred windows. Inside, more than 10,000 inmates lived packed together in a place many officers quietly called a war zone. At 2:17 a.m., an alarm shattered the silence in one of the housing units. Correction officers rushed down a narrow corridor that smelled of bleach and sweat. Inmates were shouting behind steel doors. Someone kept yelling, "Man down! Man down!" When the officers reached cell 3B-17, they froze. A young inmate lay motionless on the concrete floor. His name was Marcus Rivera, 24 years old. Arrested just 3 weeks earlier on a robbery charge. No gang affiliation. No known enemies. But the way he died told a different story. There were no visible stab wounds. No obvious gunshots. Just deep bruising around his throat and a strange mark on his wrist, almost like someone had tied something around it. Paramedics tried to revive him, but everyone in the room already knew the truth. Marcus Rivera was dead. And inside Rikers Island, death was never simple. By sunrise, investigators from the city's Department of Correction Intelligence Unit arrived on the island. Among them was Detective Laura Bennett, a veteran investigator who had spent years untangling violent crimes connected to the jail. She'd seen brutal assaults, stabbings with makeshift weapons, even riots. But this case felt different. Marcus had been locked in his cell alone. No roommate. No witnesses. And according to the security logs, the door had never been opened. Detective Bennett stood inside the small cell, studying every inch of the room. A metal bunk. A thin mattress. A steel toilet bolted to the wall. Nothing looked disturbed, except one thing. On the floor near Marcus's hand was a small piece of torn paper. She picked it up carefully. 3 numbers were written on it in shaky pencil. 914. At first, it meant nothing. But when Bennett checked Marcus Rivera's intake file, something strange appeared. Marcus had been placed in this housing unit only hours before his death. Transferred suddenly. No explanation. Someone had moved him here. Who ordered the transfer? Bennett asked the officer standing nearby. The man hesitated before answering. That came from upstairs. Upstairs where? He swallowed. Administration. That made no sense. Rikers Island processed hundreds of inmates every day. Transfers happened, but they required paperwork, signatures, reasons. Marcus Rivera's file had none. Someone had quietly moved him into this unit. And hours later, he was dead. The deeper Bennett dug, the stranger the case became. Security cameras outside the cell block had briefly gone dark for 6 minutes that night. 6 minutes. Long enough for something to happen. But not long enough for someone to enter a locked cell unnoticed. Then another discovery hit the investigation. Marcus Rivera had made a phone call just hours before he died. One call. 16 seconds long. The number he dialed traced back to a public phone in the Bronx. Detective Bennett listened to the recorded audio. The call began with Marcus whispering, "They know." A pause. Heavy breathing. Then his voice again, shaking. "I shouldn't have said anything about Rikers. They're watching every." The recording cut off. Just silence. Bennett stared at the transcript. Marcus Rivera wasn't just another inmate caught in a jail fight. He was afraid. Terrified. And somehow, someone inside Rikers Island knew exactly what he was about to reveal. But the real shock came later that evening. Because when investigators finally decoded the numbers written on that scrap of paper, 914 wasn't a phone number. It was a guard badge number. And the officer wearing that badge had been standing just 30 feet away from Marcus Rivera's cell. At the exact moment he died. The moment Detective Laura Bennett saw the badge number in the report, something cold settled in her chest. Inside Rikers Island, every correction officer wore a badge number instead of a visible name. It was supposed to create accountability. Every movement logged. Every shift recorded. But sometimes, numbers hid more than they revealed. Bennett requested the roster for the overnight shift. When the document arrived, one name immediately stood out. Officer Daniel Kessler. Badge 914. Kessler had worked at Rikers for almost 9 years. Clean record. No excessive force complaints. No disciplinary reports. On paper, he looked like the kind of officer administrators like to keep around. Quiet. Reliable. Invisible. But one detail caught Bennett's eye. Kessler had been assigned to a completely different housing unit that night. Yet security logs showed his badge entering Marcus Rivera's unit just before the cameras went dark. 6 minutes. Exactly 6 minutes. When Bennett requested the camera footage, the technician shook his head. "System glitch," he said. "Feed dropped out." "Convenient timing," Bennett replied. Still, she wanted to hear Kessler's explanation. The interview took place in a small administrative office inside the jail complex. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Kessler walked in wearing his dark blue uniform, looking calm, maybe too calm. He sat down across from Bennett without saying a word. "Officer Kessler," she began, sliding the photo of Marcus Rivera across the table. "Did you see this inmate last night?" Kessler barely glanced at the photo. "No." "You're sure?" "Yes." Bennett opened a folder. "Your badge accessed his unit at 2:09 a.m. Kessler leaned back slightly. "Must be a mistake." "Security logs rarely make mistakes," Bennett replied. He shrugged. "Maybe I walked through the corridor." "But you weren't assigned there." Silence. Kessler stared at the wall clock ticking above the door. Finally he said, "Look, detectives always think something shady is happening on this island. Sometimes an inmate just dies." The way he said it felt wrong. Not defensive. Not nervous. Just flat. Bennett ended the interview, but her instincts were screaming. Something about Officer Daniel Kessler didn't add up. Later that afternoon, another investigator brought new information. Marcus Rivera wasn't just a random inmate. 3 months earlier, he had worked as a maintenance contractor on Rikers Island. Fixing plumbing, repairing ventilation systems, moving freely through areas inmates never saw. Then he was suddenly arrested for armed robbery. The charge came from a late-night convenience store incident in Queens. The store clerk claimed Marcus pulled a gun. But surveillance footage was blurry. And the arresting officer? Daniel Kessler. Bennett stared at the report. "Wait, Kessler arrested him." "Yeah," the investigator replied. "Off duty. Said he recognized Rivera from the island." A strange coincidence. Too strange. That evening, Bennett drove to the Bronx address connected to Marcus's final phone call. The neighborhood was quiet. Streetlights flickered over cracked sidewalks. The public payphone stood outside a small laundromat. Old. Scratched. Barely used anymore. But someone had answered Marcus's call. After knocking on doors for nearly an hour, Bennett finally found the person. An older woman named Carmen Alvarez. She owned the laundromat. When Bennett asked about the call, Carmen's face immediately tightened. "Yes," she said softly. "A young man called here last night." "What did he say?" "He sounded scared." Carmen glanced toward the payphone outside. "He said, if anything happened to him, someone needed to know the truth about Rikers." Bennett felt a chill. Did he mention what truth? Carmen hesitated. Then she walked behind the counter and pulled out a small envelope. "He told me to write something down." Inside the envelope was a folded piece of paper. Bennett opened it slowly. 3 words were written in shaky handwriting. "They're moving inmates." Below it, another line. "Through the tunnels." Bennett frowned. "Tunnels." Carmen nodded. He said there were places under the jail, places no one talks about. Bennett knew Rikers Island had underground service corridors built decades ago. Old maintenance routes. But those were sealed years ago. At least, officially. That night, Bennett returned to the island and requested access to the old architectural maps of the jail complex. The dusty blueprints spread across the table revealed something disturbing. Beneath several housing units were narrow service tunnels. Connecting buildings. Connecting cell blocks. Connecting places where cameras didn't exist. And one of those tunnels ran directly beneath the unit where Marcus Rivera died. Bennett traced the path with her finger. If someone used those tunnels, they could move through the jail unseen. Move inmates. Move evidence. Maybe even move bodies. But the real shock came minutes later. Because when Bennett checked Officer Daniel Kessler's personnel file again, she discovered something that changed everything. Before working at Rikers Island, Kessler had spent 4 years assigned to the jail's underground maintenance division. Meaning one thing. If there really were hidden tunnels beneath Rikers Island, Daniel Kessler knew exactly how to use them. Detective Laura Bennett didn't sleep that night. The blueprints of Rikers Island were spread across the table in her office, every tunnel marked in red pen. Most officers working in the jail had never seen these maps. Many didn't even know the tunnels existed anymore. But someone did. Officer Daniel Kessler. And Marcus Rivera had died trying to tell someone about it. By morning, Bennett returned to Rikers Island with a small internal investigation team. They couldn't accuse Kessler yet, not without proof. But they could start asking the kind of questions that made people nervous. The first stop was the sealed maintenance corridor beneath the housing unit where Marcus died. A rusted metal door stood at the end of a long service hallway. According to official records, it had been locked for nearly 15 years. But when Bennett examined the padlock, she noticed something strange. The metal wasn't rusted. It was new. She turned to the correction officer beside her. Who replaced this? The officer shook his head. No idea. Maintenance handles that. Bennett cut the lock. The heavy door creaked open, releasing a stale rush of air that smelled like damp concrete and dust. Flashlights cut through the darkness. The tunnel stretched forward like a narrow throat of shadows. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. As they walked deeper, the walls revealed something even stranger, fresh footprints in the dust. Someone had been using this tunnel. Recently. After 20 yards, the passage split into 2 directions. One tunnel led toward another housing unit. The other, toward the administrative wing of the jail. Bennett felt her pulse quicken. If someone inside Rikers controlled these tunnels, they could move through the jail without cameras, without witnesses, without records. Which meant Marcus Rivera's death might not have been a random killing. It might have been an execution. The team followed the tunnel toward the administrative wing. After another minute of walking, Bennett's flashlight landed on something that made her stop cold. A metal chair sat in the center of a small underground room, bolted to the floor. Next to it was a plastic crate filled with zip ties, duct tape, and disposable gloves. This wasn't maintenance. It was a holding area. Someone had been bringing inmates down here. Quietly. Off the books. Then Bennett noticed the final detail. Carved into the concrete wall beside the chair were faint scratch marks. Dozens of them. Tally marks. Someone had been counting days, or victims. Before anyone could process the scene, Bennett's radio crackled. "Detective, we have a situation upstairs." "What kind of situation?" Officer Kessler just clocked in. Bennett froze. Kessler wasn't scheduled for another shift until the next night. Which meant one thing. He knew something was happening. And he came back to stop it. Bennett and her team rushed back through the tunnel and into the main corridor of the jail. But by the time they reached the security office, Daniel Kessler was gone. His locker was open. Uniform missing. Badge gone. So was his service weapon. A full facility lockdown began immediately. Every exit sealed. Every transport vehicle checked. But Rikers Island was massive. And Kessler knew it better than anyone. Hours passed. Then just after sunset, a guard patrolling the far edge of the island called it in. There was a maintenance boat missing from the dock. Kessler had escaped. The story exploded across the news within hours. A correction officer connected to a mysterious inmate death, now a fugitive. Investigators spent weeks digging through records, trying to understand what Marcus Rivera had discovered. The truth was darker than anyone expected. For years, a small group of corrupt officers had been using the old tunnels beneath Rikers Island, moving certain inmates secretly between units, intimidating witnesses, punishing prisoners who talked too much, sometimes forcing confessions, sometimes making people disappear inside the system. Marcus Rivera had stumbled onto it when he worked maintenance on the island months earlier. He saw something he wasn't supposed to see. So someone framed him for robbery, sent him to Rikers as an inmate, and tried to silence him forever. Officer Daniel Kessler was one of the men responsible. But he was also the only one who escaped. 3 months later, the investigation officially closed. Several officers were arrested. Policies changed. The tunnels were permanently sealed. But Daniel Kessler was never found. No confirmed sightings. No arrests. Nothing. And sometimes, late at night, correction officers working the graveyard shift swear they hear something strange beneath the floors of Rikers Island. Footsteps. Faint echoes moving through places that are supposed to be empty. Places that were supposed to be sealed forever. Because somewhere out there, the man who knew every hidden tunnel under Rikers Island is still free. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, subscribe now, because the next case we uncover might be even darker.